Good morning, everyone. My name is Roy Culpeper. I'm the chair of the Group of 78. Over the past month, we worked very closely with a number of organizations which share deep concerns about the $15 billion deal to produce and export light armored vehicles to Saudi Arabia, a deal clearly supported by the present government. We've written an open letter to the Prime Minister outlining our objections and asking his government to rescind the export permits authorized by Minister Dion on April the 8th. Now, I'd like to point out our organizations bring very different perspectives to this issue. Those from human rights, those from peace and security, from foreign policy and international development. Unfortunately, our colleague from the international development sector, Chantal Havard, could not join us today. But my other three colleagues here today are among 15 that signed the open letter to the Prime Minister. 12 others signed on to the letter, and yet others have indicated to us that they would like to sign or associate their organizations with the position taken in the letter. In this round, we haven't approached the labor unions or the labor movement, but we plan to do so in a subsequent round. So I'll turn over to my colleague, Alex Neve.
Good morning. I'm Alex Neve, the Secretary General of Amnesty International Canada. The debate about the sale of $15 billion worth of light armored vehicles from Canada to Saudi Arabia has often focused on job creation, honoring contracts, regional security considerations, and political alliances, but it should be focused on one single grim consideration: violations of international human rights and international humanitarian law obligations. By any measure, there is a very strong risk that these light armored vehicles, in the hands of Saudi security forces, would be used to violate international human rights and humanitarian law standards. And it is civilians in Yemen or protesters and dissidents in Saudi Arabia who would pay that $15 billion price tag. While it rarely garners the headlines, airtime at the United Nations, and political action that it should, Yemen is in the midst of a devastating war that has unleashed a staggering human rights and humanitarian crisis. Well over 3,000 civilians, including at least 700 children, have been killed. 20,000 civilians have been injured. At least 2.5 million people have been displaced from their homes in Yemen over the past year. Over 14 million are unable to meet their food needs. Over 7 million are now at risk of famine. More than 80% of the country's population are in dire need of humanitarian aid. Notably, Canadian government financial support and the hard and determined efforts of Canadian humanitarian groups is actively engaged on the ground in Yemen, trying to respond to this crisis. We need coherence in what we're doing across the entirety of Canada's policy in the region. The arms deal introduces incoherence. The human rights assessment is incontrovertible. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights has noted that Saudi forces are responsible for twice as many civilian deaths as all other forces combined in Yemen, and he talks about war crimes and crimes against humanity. The Canadian government's own human rights assessment, released recently, backs that up, even with significant redaction regarding both grave human rights concerns in Yemen and in Saudi Arabia. That is why Amnesty International has called on states around the world to halt the sale or transfer of any arms to Saudi forces, which could likely end up being used in the conflict in Yemen. And added to that concern, of course, is the reality of iron-fisted repression of opposition and dissent in Saudi Arabia itself, with security forces using an array of arms and weaponry, including light armored vehicles, to disperse and intimidate and attack protests and gatherings. We hear that Canada is putting priority on honoring our contractual obligations. We're saying today to the Prime Minister, what we need to do is to honor our international human rights obligations. That is what the world will notice, and that requires rescinding this deal. I'm now going to turn it over to my colleague, Cesar Jaramillo.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here. I'm Cesar Jaramillo. I'm the Executive Director of Project Ploughshares. Project Ploughshares has come on board with this joint letter with our colleagues in like-minded organizations in the development, human rights, and arms control community in Canada, because as the letter clearly states, we believe deeply that the integrity and the credibility of Canada's export control regime has been utterly compromised with the authorization to proceed with this deal. I'd like to talk a little bit about compliance with the obligation to comply with domestic export controls and international law, and to point out the fact that from 2 consecutive governments, we have not once heard a proper answer to the most basic question: how can the authorization of this deal be reconciled with the human rights safeguards of existing domestic export controls? Time and again, the question has been asked to the government, to 2 consecutive governments, repeatedly, compellingly, clearly, persuasively, and time after time they have deflected the question. And every time it is asked, they point to the economic benefits of this deal. They point to contractual obligations related to this deal. They point to dubious notions of credibility and reputation. They point to the number of jobs that are going to be created. But again, not once has the government addressed the very straightforward question: how can you justify this deal in light of well-known and public requirements of Canada's military export controls? In this context, I should remind all of you that the threshold established by Canada's export control regime is that the government must determine before an export proceeds that there will be no reasonable risk of misuse. The government of late has emphasized the fact that they may reconsider the permits should there be evidence of a human rights violation after the violation has occurred. This is an outright misreading of the obligations very clearly established by our export control regime. It's completely different. The standard is not evidence after the fact, after the violation, when Canada's leverage will decrease substantially, but rather an assessment of risk, of reasonable risk, before the export actually is authorized. And we don't believe that this has been the case. And the second point I'd like to make is that Canada has announced its intention to join the International Arms Trade Treaty. This is a decision we heartily welcome and stand ready to support its effective implementation. Having said that, we just do not see how the government can simultaneously express its intention to join the International Arms Trade Treaty while saying that it will proceed with a deal that is precisely the type of deal that the International Arms Trade Treaty was conceived to prevent from going through in the first place. The obvious implication, the necessary implication of the government's authorization of this deal is that they see no reasonable risk of misuse of these weapons. However, we have not heard that be articulated clearly from Ottawa. So we would urge the government to really eliminate any ambiguity and to go on the record if their position is that there is in fact no reasonable risk of misuse, to say that clearly and let the Canadian public have sufficient elements to make an assessment in this regard. Thank you very much. I'm going to turn it to my colleague, Peggy Mason from Rideau Institute.
Good morning. Bonjour. I might just say as an aside, besides being the president of the Rideau Institute, in the distant past, I was international security policy advisor to the then foreign minister, Joe Clark, when the guidelines we are discussing, the export control guidelines, and particularly the human rights guideline, were reviewed and agreed in 1986. As has been stated by the 2 previous speakers, it is absolutely clear that the human rights criteria of Canadian export control regulations require one thing: a determination that there is no reasonable risk of use against the civilian population. And again, as has been said by both previous speakers, this cannot be said to be the case with respect to the $15 billion deal to Saudi Arabia. So with that very, very clear premise, I do want to make 2 comments. One on the jobs issue and the other on the regional security considerations. The government has said there are jobs at risk. Again, as I said, the export control regulation on human rights, the human rights criteria allows no balancing. Oh, well, there's a risk, but there are jobs. But the comment I would like to add is that we would argue that it is a pernicious argument to assert that Canadian jobs must depend on the killing, maiming, injuring, and repressing of innocent civilians abroad. And there has been some polling done in this, and Canadians would seem to agree with that point. With the same caveat about the clear requirements of our export control policy, I would also like to comment on the government rationale, which we know from the documents released in the federal court case with respect to the legality of the sale, that Saudi Arabia is, quote, countering instability in Yemen. Any fair-minded observer, I suggest, would say that the opposite is the case. Not only because of the methods being used by the Saudi-led coalition, and as we heard in detail from Alex Neve of Amnesty International, amounting to war crimes according to many reports, including a UN report, but also I would refer to a new report released today it's in advance of a huge World Humanitarian Summit to be held in Istanbul next month. The organization Charity Action on Armed Violence has put a report out on the growing use of explosive weapons, particularly against civilians. And they document in detail in this report that the Saudi-led coalition in Yemen leads in the use of explosive weapons. In other words, ahead even of the barrel bombs of President Assad in Syria, and of which 90% of the casualties are civilians. So they are fomenting instability in terms of the methods that they are using, the Saudi-led coalition in Yemen. But beyond that, in terms of their intervention in the very conflict itself, very little of the Saudi-led coalition's actions in Yemen have anything to do with going after violent extremists, Al-Qaeda, for example. Occasionally they do in the south of the country. Most of their military action essentially has to do with Saudi Arabia's proxy war with Iran supplying equipment, not engaged in the conflict directly. And I think, again, any fair-minded observer would say, in fact, the President of the United States himself has commented recently on how this rivalry is a huge source of instability in the region. So those would be my comments. Thank you.
Je peux essayer, oui.
Par rapport aux arguments de M. Garneau qui dit depuis 1993, on en vend des véhicules militaires à l'Arabie Saoudite, on vend des armes à l'Arabie Saoudite. Et depuis 1993, rien montre que ces armes canadiennes n'ont été utilisées pour violer les droits humains, violer les droits de l'homme. Cet argument-là vous convainc pas?
Pas du tout. Et il y a des grandes différences entre 93, 99, 2008 et maintenant. Et c'est certainement la guerre au Yémen. Et c'est plus récent. Les informations continuent à être révélées par les organismes comme Amnesty, comme les Nations Unies. Et c'est là où vraiment nous avons des préoccupations. C'est absolument à cause des violations en Yémen qu'il y a cette préoccupation. Ce n'est pas une question de si les blindés ont été utilisés dans le passé. La question sera, est-ce qu'il y a un risque grave que les blindés sera utilisés au Yémen ou en Arabie Saoudite dans les prochains mois? Et c'est là où nous avons des préoccupations.
Vous pensez qu'il y a un risque important que ces blindés-là servent contre des populations saoudiennes ou contre des civils au Yémen? Ça, c'est ce que vous nous dites?
Absolument. Nous sommes complètement préoccupés et nous sommes convaincus qu'il y a un risque que les blindés seraient utilisés contre les civils, la population civile au Yémen, et possiblement aussi contre les gens en Arabie Saoudite, les opposants, les dissidents, les manifestants.
Pourquoi est-ce que ça ne vous suffit pas quand M. Dion dit on va garder un œil dessus? Essayez de nous expliquer pourquoi le risque, c'est là-dessus qu'on devrait se baser et non pas le fait, une fois que les blindés seraient utilisés.
Nous avons un système de contrôle des armes, pas pour faire quelque chose concernant les faits passés. Nous avons un système pour prévenir les violations dans l'avenir. Et c'est le moment maintenant pour le Canada. Nous ne voulons pas être ici dans 6 mois, 12 mois, 18 mois, parce qu'il y avait des situations, il y avait des attaques où les blindés canadiens ont été utilisés. Nous voulons voir action concrète du gouvernement maintenant pour prévenir cette possibilité.
Mr. Neve, can you explain then why votre organisation milite beaucoup en faveur de la libération de Raif Badawi? Est-ce que vous vous satisferiez d'une libération de Raif Badawi en échange du maintien du contrat?
Oh, certainement pas. C'est pas, certainement le cas de M. Badawi est un cas bien connu et certainement un exemple très grave de l'état des droits humains en Arabie saoudite. Mais sa libération ne va pas prévenir des violations de droits humains, les crimes de guerre au Yémen. Il y a beaucoup de préoccupations, pas seulement l'affaire de M. Badawi.
Mr. Neve, how can you be so sure then that these labs will be used against civilians?
It's not a question of certainty, it's a question of risk. And as the information continues to mount as to the breadth and nature of the Saudi-led coalition's violations, including what the United Nations itself has said are very likely war crimes and crimes against humanity, military operations that are involving more and more operations both from the air and on the ground, the likelihood that these light armored vehicles will end up implicated in that is very serious. I may have colleagues who may want to add to that.
Well, just to say on the point that Mr. Neve made, this notion that the threshold is neither evidence nor certainty is not a matter of opinion or from the groups we represent, nor is it a matter of wishful thinking. It's a matter of fact. It is not certainty. It is not evidence. It is reasonable risk. That is the letter of our military export control regulations. An assessment of reasonable risk before the export is authorized. Now, in terms of why we feel the risk is there, I think it's widely known that Saudi Arabia is among the worst human rights violators in the world. It's not a matter of a few unconfirmed allegations of perhaps a human rights violation here or there. They are among the very worst violators. And we not only rely for this assessment on the thorough and methodical work of several human rights organizations around the world, every one of which consistently ranks Saudi Arabia at the very bottom of any credible human rights ranking. But now we're also referring to the Government of Canada's own human rights assessment, recently released, of the situation in Saudi Arabia. And even though it was significantly redacted, the parts that were not redacted revealed, I won't try to quote, but it pointed to an increase, verbatim increase in the number of murders, executions, unreasonable detentions, etc. So even if we go by the government's own assessment that points to a deterioration of the situation, we believe the risk is clear. And to determine otherwise, really, we believe sets the bar impossibly low. In other words, the flip question is, if Saudi Arabia is considered to be an eligible recipient of Canadian-made military equipment, who would not be if we adhere to the letter of export control regulations?
Says, which is basically, if we sell these things to Saudi Arabia, then if things happen in the process, then we'll reconsider.
Right. Well, we believe that's a misreading. It's a perversion of the letter of the treaty. I mean, the letter of the treaty, again, to emphasize the point, does not point to an assessment after the fact. The letter of the treaty, not the treaty, the export control regulations, domestic existing export control regulations call for an assessment before the authorization is granted. And again, the primary criterion is neither evidence nor certainty, but reasonable risk. And we consider that risk to be evident.
We have a situation where you have human rights groups like yours saying, and saying that we should be canceling this. We have somebody, the stature of Rowan Codler and Lloyd Axworthy saying that we shouldn't be selling these kind of arms to the Saudis. The government's painted itself in a corner. It doesn't look like it's going to change its mind on this. So, what do you think is going to what will it take for them to change their mind? I mean, they haven't been moved by people like Irwin Codler and Lloyd Axworthy.
Right. Well, I would remind folks that only recently the government has very explicitly said that should it encounter new relevant reports, relevant information to this deal, it would reconsider or cancel or suspend even the existing authorizations for this deal. In addition, as soon as the government of Canada, as soon as Canada joins the International Arms Trade Treaty, Article 7 of that treaty specifically encourages states parties to reassess export authorizations even after they have been granted. Even after they have been granted, should relevant reports emerge related to that authorization. So, given Saudi Arabia's rapidly deteriorating situation of human rights and a pattern of consistent violations of the human rights of their citizens and of late of the civilians in neighboring countries, we don't think it's far-fetched to consider the possibility that there will in fact be new reports relevant to this deal. So what we would hope is that the government will live up to its promise to reconsider the authorization in light of new relevant reports.
Could you clarify the export permits, the fact that they were issued a couple of weeks ago, and Stéphane Dion had kind of given the idea that, you know, he was kind of stuck with this thing. It was the previous government. And then we found out about the export permits. Was that the time to turn things around?
The government had, I mean, ideally, well, let's back up a bit. For some time, many organizations, including the Rideau Institute and Project Ploughshares, and had been making this distinction, had been saying, the government keeps saying it's a done deal, but the export permits haven't been granted. That is within the total control of the government. The law requires that they apply the export controls before any permits are granted. How can the government, therefore, it's not a done deal in the sense of nothing can be shipped until you grant the permits. Therefore, the government must take its responsibility, must act, do its duty, and properly apply the export control regulations. Unfortunately, the government chose not to do that. And then we found out through the court case that, in fact, the government had granted the permits. And as has been pointed out in very excellent reporting on this, that made it very clear that it wasn't a done deal, that in fact it was completely within the hands of the government of Canada, not only in their hands, but they are required to apply export control guidelines before granting any permits. So yes, that would have been the moment to pull back and say, since this deal was formally signed between the Canadian Commercial Corporation and the Saudis, a lot has happened. There might have been problems then, but the situation with respect to human rights abuses has only gotten significantly worse. And so any fair application of the export control guidelines should have led the government to deny the permits. And that's one of the things that is so frustrating. When Minister Dion says he will rigorously apply the export permits in the future, he has to rigorously apply the export control regulations throughout, not in the future, but now and going forward. And he clearly has not rigorously applied the clear language. I mean, there's overwhelming evidence of a reasonable risk. That is the determination. I just wanted to throw in one other point, and that is with respect to the past evidence. The actions of Saudi Arabia in Bahrain during the suppression of the Arab Spring in Bahrain, and I think it was 2011, that action, and there's a lot of evidence that Canadian labs were used. I note that the government has never denied that Canadian labs were used. They've always said, well, where's the evidence they were used? Presumably the government has it within its ability to find out one way or the other. But as a result of that action, in terms of the negotiations that were going on for the current lab deal, the Germans pulled back. We were in competition with the Germans and the French. The Germans had tanks, Leopard tanks that they were trying to sell, and they pulled back and ultimately canceled the deal. And it looks very much like we got our deal because we didn't have any such consideration ourselves of the possibility, the risk. So in terms of the Prime Minister using this example, or the Foreign Minister using the example, if we don't sell them, someone else will. Well, it looks like Germany didn't, and then we jumped in. So this is hardly the example in terms of upholding international human rights that we would want to see.
Brick wall. They've talked about everything: penalties, export permits. We're stuck with this.
We still have the court
don't look
case.
like they're gonna change their minds.
Well, first of all, we have the court case. We have two things. We have the ongoing court case, because there's the issue of whether or not the export permits were actually in any reasonable sense applied, and that will be argued. Now, when there's any kind of discretion, the courts are reluctant. I don't want to opine on that. There's also the broader issue of whether under international law, given the allegations of war crimes against Saudi Arabia, that in fact the supplying of Saudi Arabia in such circumstances might itself be a breach of international law. And I think that if the court finds, even if a court doesn't go so far as to say the deal is illegal, if the federal court rules that Canada's continuation with the granting of export permits is a violation of international law and complicity in war crimes, the government, I think, would be hard pressed not to reconsider. The other point, which has been made by Cesar Jaramillo, is that the situation is just going to get worse. In other words, this is not going to go away. All indications are that the human rights abuses, both in Saudi Arabia and by Saudi Arabia elsewhere, are going to continue. And so it's not going to go away for the government. Thank you.
L'ampliement des emplois, l'ampliement économique, est-ce que, à votre avis, la seule façon que le gouvernement doit procéder, c'est annuler le contrat, ou on peut exiger des garanties ou autre chose et aller de l'avant quand même?
C'est très évident que les garanties ne sont pas les garanties. Il faut abolir les permis. C'est pas nécessaire d'annuler la vente. Il faut appliquer les règlements de contrôle des exportations. Ça veut dire de résilier les permis. Cette question des emplois, j'ai déjà dit que c'est absolument affreux pour le gouvernement de prendre la position que les emplois au Canada doivent dépendre aux violations graves des droits humains. Ça ne peut pas... Si notre économie ne peut pas dépendre ce fait.
What's the big attraction with Saudi Arabia in terms of why is every government so willing to do business with it?
Thanks. I mean, for one thing, they have deep pockets, and I'm not being facetious. I mean, the military budgets have historically or are in a tendency to shrink in some of our traditional customers, if you will, including NATO partners, etc. So we've gravitated to these new markets that are that wealthy, they have the money to pay, and they have a constant demand for weapons. But this sort of commercial enthusiasm should be tempered by our domestic export controls and our international obligations, and that is their raison d'être, if you will, to put a brake on the desire to sort of follow the money and make profit, and there is all the more reason to strictly adhere to the spirit and specific provisions of our domestic export control regulations.
I'd just like to add one thing, and that is the question was not why is every country, and it's very, very important to recognize that it's not every country. I've already gave the example of Germany canceling a very valuable contract. Sweden has canceled, a significant arms defense exporter has canceled its 10-year military cooperation contract with Saudi Arabia. Recently, Belgium denied an export permit. Other parliaments and so on have passed resolutions saying their governments should investigate and in the meantime have embargoes. But the examples I've given are tangible actions. Belgium, another country that is a significant defense exporter. These are countries that are stepping up to the plate and they are taking the action that is required.
And if,
Sale then, in terms of the government's position that this is a kind of feminist government, a human rights government, what do those, that facade or whatever do to, what does that do in terms of the actual business they're doing then? And how the government works?
These are not sunny ways. The actions of the government with this was an important test. And of course the important tests are tests that aren't easy, where you have to, where the decision, taking the decision in order to uphold values, in this case it's not just upholding Canadian values, it's upholding Canadian law and Canadian regulations and international law. But in that circumstance, it was not an easy decision to make. But to not stand on the side of Canadian export control policy, Canadian law, international law, and the clear ethical position is to put the lie to the argument that the new Canada is back.
And I think it's particularly timely to be asking ourselves this question: trade with Saudi Arabia at what human rights price this week? Because we know there's a very large Canadian trade delegation in Saudi Arabia this week, led by former London area Conservative MP Ed Holder. It's not an official government delegation, but it certainly is a significant Canadian presence on the ground in Saudi Arabia, obviously looking for as many trade and business openings as possible, and whether it be with respect to something as egregious as arms deals or a whole host of other ways in which we do business with Saudi Arabia, it's incumbent upon the government to bring some human rights rules and leadership to what may be going forward here.
Le Canada devrait aller jusqu'à rompre ses liens diplomatiques avec l'Arabie saoudite?
I mean, certainement, ce n'est pas la position de nos groupes que Canada doit couper les relations diplomatiques avec l'Arabie saoudite. Le contraire, nous avons une relation, c'est une relation compréhensive et certainement, c'est la responsabilité du gouvernement d'utiliser toutes les connexions entre les deux pays pour promouvoir la protection des droits humains, pour être certain que nous ne faisons rien qui va contribuer aux violations des droits humains et utiliser notre influence pour la protection des droits humains.
If I may, I think if there can be a silver lining to this whole Saudi arms deal debacle, if you will, is that it shines a light on the very urgent need to have an honest look at how our export control system works. I mean, this is an export control system that at the moment does not have any form of parliamentary oversight. There was an effort recently to establish a subcommittee in the House of Commons that was unsuccessful. We hope there will be other opportunities and that they will in fact be embraced to examine really the strength of our export control system, which the government very publicly calls one of the strongest in the world. But we have deep reservations about the strength of an export control system that deems that considers Saudi Arabia undoubtedly one of the worst human rights violators in the world, eligible to receive Canadian-made military goods, and in turn linking the economic well-being of Canadians with the suppression of human rights internationally.
Gouvernement qui dit que c'est bon si on décide de déchirer le contrat, la signature du Canada va être dévaluée. Alors, qu'est-ce que vous pensez de cet argument?
En anglais,
Pour nous, nous croyons que plus important est la signature du Canada sur les traités internationaux concernant les droits humains. Et parce que l'argument contraire est que si nous continuons avec cette vente des blindés, notre signature sur des traités très importants concernant la protection des droits humains sera déshonorée. Et ça, c'est notre préoccupation.
The government says it's going to change things going forward and be more open and transparent in terms of deals. It doesn't really explain how, but are you optimistic or?
Obviously, we welcome and we look forward to improvement in the future. That does not mean that we should not be doing the right thing immediately, right now. We should be doing both. We should actually be using this particular example as an opportunity to get it right, to make sure that we've got the right assessment, the right test about reasonable risk is what is guiding the process, that there's greater transparency for the public, that there's more accountability to Parliament. All of that should be putting in place right now for this deal, not only for imagined deals that may come up 18 or 24 months from now.
There you go.
Just on the export, on being more open in the future, Cesar referred. I just want to go into a little bit more detail. There was a motion put forward some weeks ago in the Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs for a subcommittee on control of arms exports, roughly based on a British subcommittee model. There was actually a great deal of activity in terms of the public and various organizations sending their views to all of the members of the Foreign Affairs Committee to let them know how important they thought having a subcommittee that would oversee, review. It would mean there would be expertise developed potentially within the Foreign Affairs Committee. They might make recommendations in the future. A lot of individuals Canadians and organizations made their views known that they thought this was a good idea. It was last week, the vote was 5-4 with the government members voting against and the NDP and the Conservatives voting in favor of having this subcommittee. And the comment I would like to make very, very sadly is that with that vote of 5-4, it's really hard to determine which the Liberal members of the committee or the Conservative members of the committee were being more cynical in their voting. And I'm very sorry to say that.
Just a brief comment on your earlier question about transparency going forward. I mean, our counter question is, when does going forward begin? Because even before the bulk of the export permits were granted, only in April, even before that, we had already heard the promise from the current government about further transparency going forward. Yet after this promise was made, we learned that the export permit authorizations were granted. So it's not really clear to me, I mean, when that transparency is set to begin. But I will remind you that this is the implementation of this deal will last at least until the year 2028. So we wonder how they can reconcile that this purported desire and willingness to be more transparent with the actual reality that for the next 13 to 15 years will be enabling one of the most oppressive regimes in the world. And briefly on your question, if I may, of credibility, I mean, I think that's a specious argument at best. I mean, the credibility, the dimension of Canada's credibility that's taking the biggest hit is when as it relates to Canada's willingness to uphold the protection of human rights internationally. That's going to be a bigger hit. And one can imagine how in the coming months and years, again until 2028 at least, that this deal is supposed to be implemented, there will emerge several occasions when Canada will want to have a say on very concrete matters related to human rights, and we fear that these overtures by Canada will be met with skepticism and with disdain, because Canada cannot be preaching human rights while at the same time be shipping weapons to one of the most oppressive regimes in the world.
Je peux ajouter en français pour répondre à cette question. En ce qui concerne la crédibilité, j'ai mentionné avant la Suède, la Belgique ont annulé ont refusé les permis. Et avant, il y a 2 ans, l'Allemagne a fait la même chose. Alors, ces pays démontrent la crédibilité qui compte. Merci.
La Suède, la Belgique, l'Allemagne, le Canada arrêtent de vendre des armes à l'Arabie Saoudite. Il va y avoir un autre pays qui va en produire et qui va en vendre à l'Arabie Saoudite. Un pays qui pourrait être plus ambivalent, comme le dit M. Dion. Tant qu'à y être, on va les vendre. On sait au moins qu'ici, l'argent va servir à quelque chose de bon plutôt que de le donner dans un régime qui est peut-être plus répressif lui-même, qui vendrait des armes à l'Arabie saoudite?
On peut dire, bon, la complicité, quelqu'un d'autre va faire les abus des droits humains, alors ça ne fait pas de différence si c'est nous ou un autre pays. C'est incroyable de cette argumentation que c'est le gouvernement du Canada qui a la responsabilité d'assurer que le Canada ne soit pas complicite dans les violations du droit international. Ce n'est pas la responsabilité du gouvernement du Canada d'assurer qu'un autre pays n'est pas complicite. La responsabilité de notre gouvernement est d'assurer que le Canada, il n'y a pas de complicité du Canada avec les violations, les abus des droits, les droits humains.
Si un pays qui abuse des droits humains produit ces armes-là et ensuite le vend à l'Arabie saoudite, c'est pas 2 fois pire que d'avoir un seul pays qui viole les droits? Si le contrat va à un autre pays qui viole les droits humains, qui a de l'argent dans ce contrat-là.
Je ne sais pas si je comprends.
Mais je crois que nous voulons voir deux étapes du Canada ici. Certainement, la première étape sera d'annuler cette vente ou suspendre la vente jusqu'au moment qu'il y a une amélioration. Je ne sais pas quand, avec la situation des droits humains. Mais deuxièmement, le Canada doit travailler plus fort pour un embargo compréhensif au niveau international qui va appliquer à tous les gouvernements, tous les pays. C'est la position de Amnesty et beaucoup d'organismes au niveau international, un embargo compréhensif contre, pas seulement contre l'Arabie saoudite, mais contre tous les pays qui sont impliqués maintenant dans la guerre au Yémen. Alors, il y a les deux étapes. Ce n'est pas seulement nous, c'est aussi une question d'une réponse globale.
General Dynamics then, do they just go out of business, or do maybe they sell other things? I don't know, but that's what they're shipping. That's what their employees do.
Again, this comes back to it's not our responsibility to figure out, how the Canada's economy is going to be built. But again, we come back to the point that it cannot be. Surely it cannot be the position of the Canadian government that our economy depends on the export of weapons to countries that are going to be engaged in such serious, not only human rights abuses. I come back to the other point that I made about how destabilizing Saudi Arabia is. I'd also like to just add with respect to the arms embargo, with respect to the call for the arms embargo, and that is a number of countries have called for a full embargo. UK Parliamentary Committee called for an embargo on exports until a full review could be done. The Parliament of the European Union has called for it. The Dutch Parliament has called for it. So there are many calls for a full embargo. Et alors, je peux ajouter en français cette question de l'embargo. Le Parlement de l'Union européenne et aussi un comité pour le Parlement de la Grande-Bretagne et aussi le gouvernement, le Parlement néerlandais. Ils sont tous appelés pour un embargo total en ce qui concerne les armements à Yemen et de
And
Suède.
this is probably the last comment because time is out. Just to emphasize the fact that we strongly reject the notion that it makes no difference whether the weapons shipped are shipped by Canada or another country. It makes a huge difference, if only for the fact that in one scenario, Canada could be complicit in the violation of human rights of civilians. In the other scenario, it's still problematic, and it's a debate that other nations need to have. But if somebody else is doing the selling, then Canada would not be complicit in the violations of human rights, and that's a crucial difference in our opinion.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Merci.